And I think it's probably the most difficult lecture from the whole course. So I hope you can pay attention and try to listen, because it really lays the foundation for what our brain does and how the mind is created. So you have heard about this mad cow disease recently. As a result of it, 4.4 million cows in the UK were slaughtered. And basically it's a disease of a culture, because basically what happened is they start feeding these cows food which had remnants of other animal brains, and they became infected, and it caused the behavior to go funny. So therefore it's called mad cow disease. But if a human would eat meat from a cow which was infected, the same thing would happen, and it would also go to the brain and cause a degenerative brain disorder, leading to early dementia and death. So we know about this, but it's not the first time it was described, that type of thing. 100 years ago, Martin Reichhardt, he was a psychiatrist in Würzburg in Germany. He studied the cause of syphilis, a spirochete, small cell, Treponema pallidum. And he found that his syphilic patients died suffering from a clinical syndrome which was called progressive paralysis. So only 3 to 5% of people who were infected developed this syndrome. Usually it took only two or three decades after they became infected. And the syndrome was characterized by progressive forgetfulness. And shortly after the establishment of this infection, these people developed a remarkably happy and unworried mood. So sufferers believed that they were world leaders and that they were able to eliminate all possible disease and disaster that threatened the globe. They also seem to think that they could acquire great wealth in no time. So some were also convinced that they were world champions themselves, or even the Pope. 2, at the end of the disease, suddenly drop dead and become bedridden and became completely apathic. So how is it possible that they died from a so-called psychiatric disease? So this was what was investigated. Now, a fundamental biological decision is to stay away from the environment. All biological life is separate from the environment. Life on Earth would be impossible without energy and sun rays from the sun. So there has to be an interface between the two. So there has to be some contact with the outside world, otherwise you cannot survive. So nature developed a semi-permeable cell membrane. So that's a difficult name, but it means a very sophisticated molecular filter maze. That's basically what it is. So that separates the outside world from the inside world. So it became clear that brain function was obviously not only limited to psychic processes, but that the brain was also doing biological functions. So I just want to give one example. We all think that we have got our personal taste and that only certain foods agree with us. But vital nutrients are naturally delicious to us, while, surprise, surprise, harmful substances taste extremely sour or bitter. So our taste is not an individual thing which we determine, it's an expression of a biological arrangement vital for our development and survival. It was not the ability to taste that came first, but it was a diverse range of nutrients in the outside world from which we had to select the right one. And therefore, if you select the right one, it tastes sweet to us. If it's the wrong one, it's bitter. So taste has always been and always will be a biological function. I want to give you another example. Anencephaly, so that's basically an expensive word for people born without the cortex, the big brain. And this is a picture of how these children look. And recently we know that, the last 10 years, there's been a terrible infection of Zika virus, which is mosquito borne. And if someone is pregnant and they get bitten by this mosquito, the baby develops in an abnormal way, and the big brain doesn't grow. So these children don't have consciousness; they are not aware of anything. But the interesting thing is that if you drip a sweet liquid like sugar on their tongue, so they're not aware of anything, these babies, they start to make pleasant smacking sounds, and it's followed with swallowing movements. So they obviously like it. Well, if you give them a sour or a bitter liquid, it immediately causes reflex-resistant movements of lips and tongue. They don't want to have to do anything with this bitter or sour stuff. So human taste is determined at a very primitive and archaic level, and not what we think by our conscious ego. So why would vegetative and psychic functions develop in the same organ, in the brain? So the anatomical structure of the brain provides an unmistakable indication that psychic phenomena have arisen from vegetative processes. So I want to discuss, I don't know how many of you are familiar with MacLean. In the 1960s, he introduced the concept of a triune brain. So there's a reptilian complex, which is the center. On top of that, later is a mammalian complex, and first an old-fashioned one, and then a more modern one. So this is basically how he drafted the brain. So you see the red part is the reptile, the very primitive brain, and then the yellow part is the early mammalian, and then in our brains, the green area is the human part. So actually, we are a living fossil, believe it or not. So most of you are probably familiar with I don't know how you pronounce this, it's coelacanth, which was discovered, rediscovered, I should say, on the 23rd of December in 1938 on the coast of South Africa. And I'm delighted that Professor Lazarus is here in the public, because they call it the Lazarus taxon. So this is a species which was long believed to be extinct. Actually, the oldest fossils they were found was 66 million years. And then suddenly someone catches one. It's unbelievable. Huh? But like the coelacanth, we are also living fossils. We also got a hindbrain, which is 1.5 billion years old. Then we've got a midbrain, which is approximately 1 billion years old. And then we've got our cerebrum, the newest acquisition, the forebrain, which is about 500 million years old. So we, very much like these fish, are also living fossils. So, for instance, why are we scared of snake and spiders? I think most of us are very scared of that. Arno Oman, he's a psychologist from Sweden, he did very interesting research. And he says that the majority of people are scared of snakes and spiders, which really do not represent a major threat to us modern humans anymore. But of course they did in the past. He did a lot of experiments. For instance, he gave students pictures of all kinds of animals, and they had to press the button when they were scared. And it's amazing that when he showed pictures of wild animals, they pressed the button, but when they saw a spider or a snake, they pressed it so fast that he could prove that the reaction is hardwired in our brains. They also did very interesting experiments in which they had 6-month-old babies, and they showed them pictures of wild animals. So a 6-month-old baby, they measure, it's very difficult to measure if they're anxious or not, but you measure the pupil, the width of the pupil. And if you give them a picture of a snake or a spider, the pupil gets much wider than you show them a lion or a dog. So it's proof that it's hardwired in our system. So why would we be scared of snakes and spiders? Now, of course, if you go down in our biological pedigree, you see that one of our forefathers was the tarsiers, a little animal which lived in the trees, and their natural biggest enemy is spiders and snakes. So the Afrikaans with this nachapi, I'm sure you're familiar with these things. So 1.5 billion years ago, unicellular organisms first joined to become a multicellular organism. The only contact with the outside world was through a narrow channel between the cells. So the composition of the fluid within these channels is closely resembling seawater. So although we think of us of a complete different animal, we also consist of cells which are kept together in a fluid, extracellular fluid, which is almost identical to oceanic water. Just look at this. This is the ratio of molecules. So sodium, potassium, and calcium chloride. It's in seawater is 100 to 2 to 2, and in our extracellular fluid it is 100 to 2 to 1. So it's almost the same. So one of the first organisms, most primitive, is the volvox. It's a little ball containing a few hundred cells only. And in order to communicate with each other, they developed synapses to pass on either an electric or a chemical signal. And a little bit later, you get the hydra, a water animal, which developed a small invagination in its wall. And there was a primitive mouth to ingest nutrients and excrete waste products. The tentacles, they curl up towards its mouth when in contact with glutathione, which is amino acid which is only only present in living waterflies. So all mammals maintain a very steady temperature. Actually, the temperature is regulated to 1/10 of a degree. Now, if you insert a very fine tube into the temperature center in the brainstem and you inject warm or cold fluids, we can provoke exactly the same effect as a massive heat wave or freezing cold weather. And actually the term we use for it is goose flesh, which actually refers to a long time ago, the time we still had feathers. So feeling hot or cold, once again, is just a biological function. It's not you decide I have it cold or I'm too hot. It is a reflection of what your body requires. Now, if you look at the brainstem, the very primitive brainstem, there's a whole number of centers. There's a temperature center, an emergency center, fright and flight, a bodily fluid center, a circulation center, breathing center, metabolic center. And all these centers are in the brainstem, dealing with survival. Now there's a famous saying, less is more and more is less, which is, I think, very applicable to many things in nature. Nature does it as minimalistic as you can do. And I want to describe some experiments by Nicholas Tinbergen. He won a Nobel Prize for his research. So many of his research involves buzzard and chicks. So one of the first things he did, he had a aviary with chicken chicks. And then he manufactured a wooden cross. He manufactured a wooden cross, just 2 planks, and then he had a construction moving this wooden cross over the top of the aviary. So what was amazing, that if he did it in the one direction, in this direction, So if the cross would move over the aviary in this direction, the chickens were panicking like hell. They were running all sides and making screeching noises. If he would move the same cross in the other direction, there was no alarm, amazingly. So they were just sitting and going on with their normal activity. Now, if you look at this graph, you look at the silhouette of various birds, it starts to make sense, because you can see an egret, so a benign, I just lost my pointer. Let me see if I can get another one. If it's a benign bird, like an egret or a swan, they've got a long neck in the front, while if it's an eagle, it's the other way around. So that makes sense. I think the whole battery, I think the battery must have packed up. Okay, we go on with. So the chicks only panicked when they saw something they were not familiar with. Because swans and other benign birds, they fly over this aviary all the time, so the birds are used to it. But if there is something unusual, then they panic. So how can we explain this phenomenon? It's quite easy, actually. The mechanism whereby the chicks responded, it's got nothing else, it's nothing more than just plain adaptation. If you see something a lot, you become familiar with it, it's becoming normal. If it's unusual, you panic. So all cells, they continuously produce ATP, which would, if there would be a signal which is all the time telling a cell to produce a signal, it all the time has to create this ATP. And it would lead to exhaustion of the cellular energy stocks very rapidly. So it would lead to burnout. Any ongoing trigger would rapidly phase out. And we are all very familiar with this phenomenon. If you, for instance, move into thank you so much, into a room with a particular smell, you notice it when you walk in. Once you're in there for a few minutes, it's gone. It's phased out. And then only when you move out an hour later and you go to outside, and suddenly you smell again, oh, this is fresh air. But your body adapted to that. Life is not anything just reacting into the same manner all the time. It creates a model of its environment and order in the apparent chaotic environment in which we live. So life is to build order in a closed system of action and reaction. That's what it is. The strongest triggers for any reaction are not features that are permanently present, but are the features which are perceived for the first time or keep on changing. Now, roughly you can divide all living beings in the botanical and animal kingdom. If you cut yourself, if there's a physical threat, you cut yourself, it immediately gives you an unpleasant experience. But it's very different with light, the way we use the sense of light. We can see things which are miles away around us. So it doesn't have to touch us directly. The border of our sensation is not our border of our body, but it's much wider. It's as far as we can see. And actually we can see some galaxies which are billions and billions of kilometers away, and we can see them. So they can warn us about potential threats. So this is a major advantage. So euglena, which is also discovered by this Dutch guy, Anthony Leeuwenhoek, which I was telling you about yesterday, the name for it is eye animal. It contains this little red pigmented piece. You can see it here. So it's got a piece of pigment, and then just under it is a light-sensitive structure. So the way it uses it, that if there is shadow on this cell, then it knows how to move in order to reach the light. And they call that process phototaxis. It moves to the light. But it also, very importantly, this animal shows that biological function. We can only see light when there is contrast. So there is this pigmented, you see a schematic thing here, and here's the real animal. You see this little pigment in there, in the cell. And then the sensitive part is just under there. So if the light is coming from one direction and the pigmented part shields it, it's a different signal than when the animal is in this way, in which the light can directly fall on. So the substance creating the red spots is carotenoid, which is very similar to all side pigments in all high animals, rhodopsin. So they're very similar. The microscopic study of the cones and bars in the mammalian retinas leaves no doubt that they are directly derived from this little animal. So our eyes consist of these tons of these little animals, slightly adapted. So this is a picture of a planaria with two very primitive eyes. Each eye only contains 1,000 light-sensitive cells. Now, you probably have seen this. This is a proposed way in which the eye developed. So it's first just sensitive, a few, I don't know what's this something going on. I think the batteries are old. So first a few sensitive cells, and then probably it was an advantage if it would be in a little caved-in part of the wall, of the organism wall, because it would be protected, and then later it developed into an eye. There's lots of books written on this and articles. So this happened over a period of 3 million years. Fish battery, try again. Just want to, this was before I became aware of it, but I think some of you may still remember the Space Shuttle in 1965. The first time the astronauts went up, they were telling an unbelievable number of interesting stories. And they claimed that they could see boats and trucks from a distance of 150 kilometers above the Earth. Now, if you calculate, the highest resolution we can reach is 1 arc minute. I don't want to go into the technical parts, but that translates to about 300 meters of 150 kilometers. So you wouldn't be able to discriminate things smaller than 300 meters, but they could do that. They could identify boats and trucks. So how was it possible? How did they do that? Because it was not only the first astronauts. Other astronauts who went up were telling the same story. So they had to find an explanation for it. So we can only see with the center of our fovea. We've got a whole eye with light-sensitive cells, the retina, but only that middle little thing can see colors, because you need cones for that. Which makes it almost impossible to see stars. If you look at the star, especially through a telescope, you'll find that you can only see color with the middle part of your fovea. So if you focus on the star, you don't see it. So you have to look next to the star, and then it appears, because it's like white light. So the mammalian eye can only see through a retina that is continuously in motion. So our eyes can only see because they move all the time. If something is fixed to the eye globe, so it makes exactly the same movement as your eye, you cannot see it. And that's good news, because at the back of the retina, where the cells are, in front of it is all the blood vessels the artery and the veins, they're laying in front of it. And fortunately, we can't see them because they would block our vision. So everything which is permanent, which is in the same position to the retina cells, cannot be seen. So therefore, our eyes, they move all the time. So we are totally blind for objects that remain static to the retina. So we see, seeing only moving things makes the sense of evolutionary point of view. Most things that move are either food or enemies. And it's only in mammals. Amphibian, reptiles, and birds, they don't have it. So the reason that these people could see with a much bigger discrimination was that because there's no resistance in the atmosphere above in the cosmic space, the eye movements, instead of moving a little bit, they move much wider. Yeah, so the eyes, the amplitude of the eye movement is much more than on Earth because there's no resistance, and therefore they were able to pick up these very tiny objects. So it's only in mammals that our eyes moved. So the other animals, they don't have that. So what we see is not an objective part of the world. It's created by our own bodies. So there was an American physiologist, Ledwin, and he did a lot of research on the frog's eye, physiological research on the frog's eye. So what does the frog's eye, what type of signals does it send to the frog's brain? It's a famous article. And this is just some pictures from that article. So basically the main messages which the frog brains receive from the frog's eye is contrast, so difference between light and dark, the size of an object, and the speed of movement. So vision is actually a primitive alarm system. So what I mentioned is that we create an illusion of the world. We can only see with the very middle part of our retina, we can see color. So only the middle thing we look at is color. But yet, when we look around, we see color all over. That's all illusion. The brain creates that. We can't perceive it. We only perceive on the side. We only perceive black and white. And it's very primitive. So in the middle of the fovea, each and every retinal cell is connected to one nerve cell. But on the side, it's like tens of thousands of cells are combined, the message, in one nerve, which makes it much more sensitive but less precise. So the human eye basically has got an alarm function. And in the periphery, when there's any movement, we can't see it, but the function of it is to pull our eyes, to pull our attention. So you know that, we all know that you go into a room and you feel, you're not consciously aware, but you feel something. And you look, and there's a cat sitting in the corner looking at you. So that doesn't go conscious, it goes unconsciously. Unconsciously, your attention is pulled there. So unconscious vision came before our conscious vision. And the eye was probably a trigger for our big brain. So now I'm changing the story to inherited experiences. This guy, Walter Rudolf Hess, he won the Nobel Prize in 1949. And he did it by experiments. It's very easy to stimulate certain brain centers. So you just drill a hole in the skull, put a fine electrode in there, and then when you're in the center, you just give a small electric stimulus. So he did it to various parts of the brain. So he was able to cause, in the anterior part, a drop in blood pressure. Animals would breathe slower. Hunger and thirst he could evoke. And also micturition and defecation. And in the posterior part, lots of excitement and defense-like behavior. So these are the behaviors by stimulating different parts of the brain. Interesting enough, if you do that in the midbrain, the behavior the animal displays is completely natural. It's not. It doesn't look anything wrong. So Erich van Holst, he studied mainly poultry, and if he stimulated in this poultry the aggression center, for instance, of a cock, the cock would just take a couple of seconds to sort of like warm up, and then he would run around in increasingly agitation. And eventually, after a while, after a few seconds, he would attack any identified object of aggression, preferably a stuffed weasel. That was his favorite. But if there was no weasel in the neighborhood, he would attack just any other object or body part of the researcher. So the brain part appears to have a number of behavioral patterns ready to make a natural impression. So these packages which are stimulated are more or less finished. They're sitting there in the brain waiting to be activated. While the cerebral cortex, so if you press on the outside, if you press a little part, then you'll see the finger moves a little bit, the one finger, and then you press next to it, it's the next finger. It's like almost like a piano keyboard. But in the midbrain, you press something and you get a complete ready-made behavior. So the middle brain seems to contain entire orchestral scores ready for execution. Although the number of middle brain programs is rather limited, each species carries all the necessary coded instructions for its natural behavior, such as being awake, being asleep, eating, preying on other animals, hygiene. There's a lot of animals spend a lot of time cleaning their skin or their feathers, and defense against enemies, and of course sexual activities. Now there are two different ways of learning. For most of us, the term to gain experience represent an individual matter, like someone has been he experienced a certain event and we think he learned from that. But there are also stored experiences of the species in the past. And there's a lot of experiments done with birds. So if you take a young swallow and you just hatch him in the incubator, he's never seen any other swallow. And you can even fix his wings. So you cannot even use his wings. You can just eat and you can grow them, but you cannot actually practice. If you release these swallows after a couple of weeks, they go off, they fly immediately. So there was no learning required, no individual learning. It must have been inborn. That program must be in the middle brain. So the ability to fly is obviously inherited. Reptiles living in trees probably had a survival advantage when they were able to jump far and more precisely. So it has been commonly scientifically accepted that feathers, initially developed for probably insulation, to stay warm, may have assisted jumping from the one to the other. And you all know the fossils of our very long ago forefathers, the dinosaurs who had all kinds of feathers. So over millions of years, this gradually led to the development of an Archaeopteryx, a reptile-like protobird. So the world we live in is first and foremost shaped by the mind. So this is an important sentence. The world in which we live and what we perceive is first and foremost shaped, created by our own mind. So the behavioral patterns in the middle brain in itself are nothing new in evolution. the ready-made programs I was telling you about. But if you stimulate these with electric stimuli, they are not stimulated by direct harm, like a knife or a burn. It's indirect, it's the electric message. So of course the middle brain stays heavily under control of the brainstem, which remains under influence of the direct physical and chemical changes. So your body sees and feels things, goes via the brainstem, then goes to the middle brain, and then eventually ends up in the large brain. So when a cock is exposed to a hen, they do not automatically and all the time continuously initiate mating behavior. So what determines the threshold? Why are they, if they've got a ready-made program, why are they not displaying that all the time when they see a female? The vegetative centers of the brain regulate the levels of excitability of the middle brain programs in order to prevent transgression of biological borders. So what determines our sexual behavior? Now, interesting enough, I don't know, you may have read this book when it came out. I read it with great interest. Desmond Morris, tremendous good scientist. And he wrote The Urban Zoo. We often are told that we live in the urban jungle. Like New York, there's a picture of New York and it says urban jungle. He says nothing is less true. We don't live in an urban jungle. The behavior we display is identical to that, not of free animals, but of captured animals. You know, as animals living in the zoo. That's what we are doing. There would never be a lecture like this if we were in the wild. No one would listen to me, I can guarantee you that. So fertility is greatly influenced by seasonal changes. The conception, of course, it's very important for biological life, that in the majority of species, conception occurs in the time which ensures that when the young is eventually born, they must be born during the most favorable season of the year. It doesn't make sense for animals to copulate and produce a young in the middle of winter when it dies immediately from the cold. So how do animals know these things? Now, light is very important. Various researchers have indicated that lower animals and even plants are equally able to measure the duration of a day in minutes. Can you imagine this? So the so-called lower animals can measure the time of the day in minutes. Primitive vegetative brain centers determine and slots in the organisms into the environment. Now, for instance, in the Second World War, they sent a whole lot of German soldiers to the north of Norway to defend it. And the German soldiers which were allocated there to the Arctic, they developed severe depression. They actually also had electrolyte disturbances, and their whole sugar metabolism was disturbed. So they actually had to be pulled back. They really were dying there because they were taken out of their own environment and put in a completely different climate. So our brains harbor the image of the outside world. At the vegetative level, the contact with the environment takes place at the horizon of the physical body and predominantly at the direct physical nature. So that's the threat if someone burns you or cuts you with a knife. The development of the middle brain caused a permanent character change in this process. Via light, the perception border was transgressed from or transpositioned from the surface of your body 2 kilometers away, which is an unbelievable thing if you think about it. The process translocates the border from the organisms from the outside world and expands the organism's surrounding habitat. The middle brain behavioral programs possess an expressive character and response to stimuli. Reflecting on all these facts leads us to acknowledge that the reactive actions of the organism and the so-called ready-made programs in our middle brain are inherited as ready-made packages and already represent an image of the outside world that we cannot escape. So when we are born, our brain is full of these type of programs in which we will use to look at the outside world, and we cannot look at it objectively. So back to Erich von Holst, the founder of the Max Planck Institute. He stimulated the cock. If there was no enemy, the cock would attack a random spot on the ground. When the stimulation stopped, the cock would smooth his feathers, strut off arrogantly, crowing victoriously, as if he had just crushed a rival. It's really amazing if you read these accounts. If the electric stimulation continued for several seconds, the cock would panic, screech, and jump up and down, and perhaps trying to get away. So this behavior is definitely inherited and is also displayed by cocks that are prepared in isolation, or reared in isolation, and have never been exposed to any other members of their species from whom they could have learned it. A real weasel merely reacts, therefore, as a trigger to ignite the program in your middle brain, which is already sitting there. Therefore, at this crucial point, the cock already carries the projection of the real world within its brain, even before it crawls out of its eggshell. So I just want to finish off. I gave a lot of information, but you need to change your mind a bit on, like, we are not choosing this and we are not sensing it. It's basically what is happening is that our programs in our brain determine what we see. We have got no choice in that. We are born as human beings, and we've got a certain number of these programs, and that's how we can assess the world, if we like it or not. And I just want to end with this example. Just try walking in the dark. Nowadays, the environment, I mean, maybe not in Cape Town, but in many parts of the world is safe. But if you walk in the dark, you suddenly start to imagine all kinds of things, and it's an amazing thing. In the middle of the night, the world is the same as in the middle of daylight. It's just the sun, one of the stars shines from another side. But our perception of the whole world is completely different. If you immediately feel lonely and you feel threats, which is quite an amazing thing. So that was my last slide. And tomorrow, this was rather theoretical, but I think tomorrow you may be enjoying it more. It's more examples and more pictures, because I'm going to explain how the environment influences our brain. And I thank you for your attention, and I'm very happy to take questions. So at the back there, yeah?
To a certain extent, I imagine one can reprogram its brain. An example, if you held it in torture in a cell, you're exposed to stimuli to override these inherent programs that you talk about. I mean, is that just a temporary change, or could that become permanent?
I'm not sure if I understand your question, so I'm going to repeat it. Please tell me if I'm not. So you say, can you change your memory? Is that the question?
When you're I understand that can be triggered.
Yes.
And then there's an automatic response.
Yes.
That's not going to be inherent. To some extent, can that be overridden perhaps through the frontal brain or through the spirit?
I think it will be very difficult.
Something is not scary. Like, for instance, crossing a bridge. Yeah, we are, most of us are very comfortable crossing a bridge because our cortex has told us, there's lots of bridges all over the world, and most of them didn't collapse when I walked over them. But there are people who cannot, they're not able to override that primitive anxiety, like, I'm putting my life into danger here. I'll give you an example. I love to walk on a mountain, and I've been doing it for 20 years, and usually often go to the top. But I'm really scared in the cableway, because that's such an unnatural environment. And of course, I mean, it's illogical, because I don't think the cableway ever fell down. But my body, I can tell myself there's nothing to worry about. But I'm telling you, if I'm there, my heart rate goes up. I can't control it. So I think they are older memories, and they are stronger than what you've learned. But if you ask the question, is everything what you've learned, you can learn and de-learn things. And that is to a great advantage, because, for instance, you talked about torture, I think. If someone is tortured or someone is raped, imagine the disaster of that experience, what it could do to you. Fortunately, we can actually move it around and change it. You can go for post-traumatic stress management, and you'll tell the story again and again, and every time you tell it, you change it a little bit. And eventually you can actually fade it. You can actually forget about it. If you would not be able to change our memories, we would suffer tremendously, because each and every event which has happened in our life, we would go buried under there. So fortunately, our brain is very creative and can focus on the positive things and not on the negative. Yes?
What happens during
Hypnosis.
I'm not an expert, I'm not a psychologist, but I think I read an article many moons ago, and actually I don't believe in it, in hypnosis, but there are people who respond to it. The interesting thing is that if you watch, or the article made reference to the symmetry between being hypnotized and watching a movie. And it's apparently, it was about brain scans, and they're very similar states. So if you watch a movie about Marcus Aurelius or Gladiator, you are transferred into that period. You're watching, and you see you think you're walking through the forest in Germany, being attacked by barbarians, and it's quite amazing. You allow yourself to do that. But if your wife then says, "Hey, listen, there's a cup of coffee," then so then you're immediately fully awake, and you says, "Yeah, actually, I feel like having a cup of coffee." So hypnosis is, I think, to a very large extent the same. People allow themselves to. If you don't allow yourself to be hypnotized, no one can hypnotize you. But if you allow yourself to be hypnotized, you also allow the person to stop it. That's my personal view. Yes?
What book would you recommend that discusses what you're talking about?
This particular.
The course as a whole.
The whole course. I mean, I think Daniel Dennett wrote, of course, this From Bacteria to Bach and Back Again. Daniel Dennett, From Bacteria to Bach and Back Again, The Evolution of Mind. But it's rather philosophical. Steven Pinker in 1997 wrote a book, How the Mind Works. And I think that is that's more clear. But you can't, it's such a vast topic. There's so many ways of looking at it. Steven Pinker includes a lot of language stuff, rather than what I've been showing you today is basic biological experiments. And there's not really one book in which you can find it. Yes?
How would you explain Stockholm syndrome and also guys who were in Vietnam who experienced extreme terror and came back changed people? Is that in the cortex or is that in the midbrain?
I think it's a very good question. I was actually, I think later in one of my lectures I may be talking about it. But the question is the Stockholm syndrome. Is it cortex or is it middle brain? So the Stockholm syndrome is described, I think, 30 years ago in which a couple of people were captured in a bank in Stockholm, and they developed a sympathy for the people who actually hijacked them. What do you call it? What's the word? Kept them hostage. But that's a basic survival strategy. It's a basic survival strategy. If you are depending on people to keep you alive, of course you're going to be friendly with these guys. And I've got an example in the ward in my hospital. 6 weeks ago, there was a little child who was living on the street with his mother, basically Bergie. And I don't know if they were intoxicated, but on a Saturday morning at 7 o'clock, someone drove over them, hit and run, and drove on. So the mother was killed, and the child was deeply comatose. I was just happened to be come in the hospital when he was brought in. So we resuscitated this little boy. He's 1 year and 9 months, and he survived. He got multiple skull fractures, but his brain damage was limited, and he's completely fine now. He talks very rough in the mouth. But the interesting thing is that these children who grow up on the street, they are not like normal children. They are looking for affection each and everywhere. A child who's growing up in a normal family, he knows he must rely on his parents and not on strangers, because strangers they are a threat to him. A child who's growing on the street, and all abused children who are not cared for, they are trying to get love and food from everyone around them. So these kids, they are extremely popular, because foreign students walk in, and these children immediately jump on top of them because they see, hey, there's a victim, he can help me. So it's a survival strategy. So I think, to come back to your question, the Stockholm syndrome is just survival strategy, and it's probably a combination of a primitive behavior, which is satisfying your environment, and a little bit of planned action. Yeah?
Trying to get my head around all this in terms of timing in particular. There's so much talk nowadays about the impact of social media and technology on the way kids' brains are working. Is it conceivable that over time, in decades, not millennia, we will be selecting for a different kind of brain, or a different kind of person?
I think it's very much true like that. Unfortunately, I don't think there's anyone can stop this process, but it's definitely already on the go. All of us are watching TV all the time. And if you think about it in evolutionary terms, there are countries, I must not exaggerate, I often do that a bit, but I think there's countries, the Philippines, the average Filipino child spends 13 hours a day in front of a screen. That was the top in the list. But even in South Africa, I think it's probably 8 or 9 hours. So it's either in front of yours or the television or the computer screen. Now, of course, that must have an effect on the development of your brain. Also in warfare, in the old times, warfare was learning to shoot or with swords or whatever. Now all this computer, the people in the blowing up of the military leader in Iran just a few days ago, that wasn't done by a person. That was a couple of guys on the computer. That was like a computer game, because you sit on the screen, and you can do that from. I think it was done from Nevada in the United States. So in Nevada, they're sitting on the computer, and they've got it via drone, and they see it, and they point it, and they press the button. So the top military guys are people who are extremely good in all these computer games. Because if you're very fast and you can move it, then you're better. So I think, unfortunately, it's going to have an effect. We don't know what type of effect, but it must have. There's a English philosopher, Barbara Gartland, I think is her name. She's written a lot of on that topic. I think it's Barbara Gartland.